innovation, inequalities, solutions, new problems, dangers, and also some promises, right? And over the next hour and a half, we will be looking at some of these contradictions with the nuance that they deserve, and examining how AI can both accelerate climate action and potentially intensify the very inequities that we seek to address. So if we can move on to the next slide. So before we just dive into AI's role, we must ground ourselves in the realities of our planetary crisis. The image that you see here represents the 9 planetary boundaries frameworks, which was developed by the Stockholm Resilience Center. So it basically provides a basic foundation for understanding the Earth's safe operating space for humanity. And the sobering truth is that humanity has already transgressed 6 of the 9 planetary boundaries, and we have crossed critical thresholds in climate change, where the atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration now exceeds safe boundaries. And we have severely compromised the biosphere integrity in our biogeochemical cycles for nitrogen and phosphorus that are severely disrupted. So this context is important because it frames the urgency with which we approach climate action and evaluation. And we are operating in a space where Earth system changes likely increase risks to societies. And it's within this context of planetary emergency that AI emerges as both a potential solution and also a potential accelerator of these very problems. The widening gap illustrated here also reminds us that AI could exacerbate global inequality if we don't carefully manage it. And as we'll explore today, the communities most vulnerable to planetary boundaries transgressions are often the least able to access or benefit from AI. If we can go on to the next slide. So this is an interesting quote by Canfield and Rahim. And it nicely captures a fundamental truth, which highlights why our session today is so important. Both climate change and AI represent systemic transformations that transcend national boundaries, affect all sectors of society, and have the potential to exacerbate or help address global inequalities. Just as climate change action requires principles of distributive justice, where we're talking about ensuring a fair allocation of both burdens and benefits, AI governance must ensure equitable access to AI benefits while fairly distributing its risks and costs. And if we look at procedural justice, on the other hand, which basically emphasizes fair and inclusive decision-making processes, and is equally critical for both climate and AI governance. The communities most affected by climate change are often the same communities at risk of being excluded from AI development and deployment decision. And so also acknowledging diverse knowledge systems, values, and ways of life applies to both climate adaptation strategies and AI systems. So we cannot afford to repeat the mistakes of climate change in the AI transition. We've learned from decades of climate policies that technological solutions without attention to justice and equity can perpetuate the very problems that they aim to solve. And this insight must inform our approach to AI and climate-focused evaluations from the outset. If we can move on to the next slide, please. So today we have very experienced and knowledgeable panelists with us. We do have Mr. Jason Bygate, who's the Director of Capacitate Social Solutions, and also as part of the SAMEA Rural Tech Working Group. We also have Rebecca Mbaya, who is a researcher, writer, and social innovation strategist. And we also have Ms. Jennifer Norins, who is the SAMEA chair and is also part of Meet Africa. If we can move on to the next slide, please. So in terms of how we will be conducting the session today, the first thing that we'll do is to explore the contributions and contradictions of AI and the big data in relation to issues of climate change and just transition. And we'll put great emphasis in how it relates to evaluation. So we have Mr. Jason Bygate, who will speak to the opportunity that AI presents for evaluations and climate change evaluations in particular. And then we will have after him Ms. Rebecca Mbaya, who will focus on the social and environmental costs of AI. And then lastly, we will have Ms. Jennifer Norins, who will introduce participants to evaluation criteria, looking at equity and climate and ecosystems health, which are criteria that were developed by the SAMEA in collaboration with other partners. And then after these presentations, we'll then have a question and answer segment where then you get to engage with the speakers themselves. So without further ado, let me hand over to Mr. Jason Bygate.
Thanks, Anae. Afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here to have a conversation about the fun part of the technology. So we're going to be having a discussion about that transformative role of AI and M&E generally, and also in climate-focused evaluation specifically. And as we navigate these growing pools of data and complexities in climate change, AI is emerging more and more as a powerful tool, offering unprecedented opportunities for data analysis, predictive modeling, and decision-making. However, it's really critical to approach this technological advancement with a critical lens, acknowledging both its pitfalls and potential. Thanks, Annie. You can move on to the next slide. So as evaluators, we're in the irregular position of being overwhelmed by data. And there are increasing numbers of data sources that we're having to assimilate and interrogate. And in many ways, we're drowning in that data, but starved for insight. And this is really where AI comes in. Today, climate data in particular is coming at us from all directions. Satellite images, soil sensors, rainfall records, community reports. It's big, messy, and scattered. But AI thrives on that sort of chaos. And by learning the patterns that humans can't see, AI connects the dots across thousands of data sources, like predicting heat waves before they happen or tracking how fast glaciers are melting meter by meter. This isn't just science fiction anymore. Policymakers and communities on the front lines of climate change are now using these insights to act faster, smarter, and with greater precision. As AI gets better, it won't just tell us what's happening. It will help us to simulate what might happen and give us a fighting chance to prepare. And the key takeaway for this conversation about AI is looking at it as our climate compass, translating complexity into clarity so that we can act before it's too late. Thanks. Next slide. What we're seeing is an evolution of this technology and its capabilities. And all of us know about ChatGPT and Claude and the various offerings that are available to the public. But what we're increasingly seeing is configurable agentic AI. And this really represents the next frontier in real-time intelligence. So that rise of agentic AI. We can forget about static dashboards and frozen models. This era of AI agents serve as digital co-pilots that can adapt in real time, talk to other systems, and also learn on the fly. These agents don't wait for data to be uploaded and analyzed. They go and fetch it, scanning climate journals, live satellite feeds, or local flood centers, all in seconds. Think of them like ultra-fast research assistants and emergency responders rolled into one. And they don't work alone. Using something called model context protocol servers, these agents can coordinate now across multiple systems. If a drone spots a shrinking glacier, the AI doesn't just store the image, it kicks off a workflow, comparing historical data, updating climate models, and even issuing alerts at the rate of melt that's being detected. And then we're starting to see really interesting developments in the emergence of agent swarms. And these are multiple AI agents working together, a bit like bees in a hive, each with individual tasks responsible to integrate a collective effort. One tracks rainfall, perhaps, another tracks historical flood data, a third might map nearby shelters, all feeding into a single dashboard in real time. So AI is no longer a tool, it's becoming an active team member, and it's redefining how we monitor, respond to, and prepare for environmental threats. Thanks. Next slide. What is really exciting is looking at the convergence of technologies. So we're seeing increasingly the 4IR technologies like drones and blockchain and IoT sensors starting to integrate and be coordinated through the AI technology. And what you get is a living, breathing monitoring system that sees, thinks, and responds. So, for example, IoT sensors provide us with a real point of presence on the ground, where we're able to take direct data measurements, things like air quality, soil moisture, rainfall, and much, much more, every second across every corner of the globe. Drones can go to where people can't, capturing things like deforestation, flooding, coral bleaching, all from a remote location, and all without any necessarily human coordination. And blockchain keeps things honest, securing data, for example, on carbon credits, land use, deforestation, and reforestation claims, and ensuring that the data can't be tampered with. And what we're seeing as we see the convergence of these different technologies under the guidance of things like AI is an orchestrated data system, bringing together thousands of moving parts, turning it into real-time intelligence, and being able to trigger direct responses using a range of different technologies. So we see this as a nervous system of next generation action, and specifically focused on the climate. It gives us the insights to be able to respond in near real time, rather than waiting on the evaluation outcomes that have traditionally taken a significant amount of time to be able to implement and make changes. But the real question, and I think that our esteemed moderator has spoken to, is who has access and who's being left out. So there really are some key considerations that we need to make around the access and use of this technology, and also how it's starting to inform on our policies. Thanks. Next slide. As we start thinking about the need to act within this changing climate and changing environment, these decisions aren't just high, they're very high stakes. Where to build infrastructure, how to allocate resources, when to act on early warning systems. These aren't just academic exercises. They're real life and death questions. AI helps to simulate what happens if something happens. So if you build a dam here, shift crops there, or launch a carbon tax, it plays out scenarios, models ripple effects, and surfaces trade-offs before they become regrets. In cities, AI can show us how trees are reducing heat. In farming, it can help us predict food security under drought. And when things change suddenly, new data from a satellite feed or new reports, AI can update instantly, giving you immediate feedback for your next move. And AI isn't replacing policy, it's upgrading it, it's augmenting it. And if you think of your climate GPS, helping leaders to navigate uncertainty with more confidence. Thanks. Next slide. But of course, with every light side, there is a dark side. And as we start to look more closely at the cost and the implications of this new technology, it's really important to consider the negative implications. So those pitfalls that come with new change and new technology. So as we start to think about those costs and implications, there is a dark side to AI. In particular, it is about who gets left behind. Our colleague Rebecca will speak more to the direct environmental costs and some of those unseen costs. But it's important to recognize that AI is not neutral. So we often think of a technology as something that is completely independent and agnostic, but increasingly there's evidence to show that the AI is not neutral. It learns from the data that's been given. And too often, that data comes from a very narrow lens. In many cases, mostly Western or Eastern, mostly male, and mostly elite. In a recent study, over 67% of chatbot responses came from a US-based male academics. Indigenous voices, just about 2%. And it's not just a representation issue, it's a risk. Because when AI systems don't reflect local realities, they recommend policies that may not work, or worse, can cause harm. Imagine an AI that tells a government to map land without considering customary tenure, or an early warning system that sends alerts in the wrong language. So these are key considerations to think about as we're looking at the benefits of the technology, but also the potential costs and implications of applying this technology. So AI can amplify bias just as easily as it can amplify insight. We must constantly ask whose knowledge counts and who is being erased. Thanks. Next slide. And as we talk about those segments of our population that are being erased or ignored, we do have to recognize the digital divide and the barriers to access and inclusion. The most vulnerable people in the country and in the world are often the ones that are least likely to benefit from changes in technology. And primarily that's because AI and other technologies need things like data, electricity, internet, skills, money. And these are scarce in regions across the world, and in particular, those that face the harshest climate shocks. If we're not careful, AI for climate could become a luxury, not for the few, not a lifeline for the many. It could centralize power, widen inequality, and make vulnerable communities even more dependent on systems that they didn't help to build and can't influence. And the digital divide is also about climate justice. If AI isn't co-designed with those on the front lines, there are significant risks of it becoming part of the problem. The technologies can certainly accelerate and deepen the dimensions of inequality that are already in place. So it is important for us to consider as we're applying these new technologies, how are we driving inclusion, how are we driving equity, and how are we ensuring that the technology represents the collective experience of the entire world and not just a select elite. Thanks. Next slide. So where do we go from here? There's obviously enormous potential within the technology. There's some incredible benefits that it brings, but also we need to consider the potential costs. And where do we go? I think firstly, we need to look at how we apply the technology in a human-centered way that's built on equity, designed for inclusion, and governed with care. We need to train the AI on the realities of Nairobi, not just New York. And that means local knowledge, indigenous practice, and climate realities of the global south. We need to build infrastructure where it's needed most, train community technologists, co-create tools with users, not just for them, and be green by design. We need to fight climate change with energy-hungry AI, but we need to make it lean, efficient, and circular. We also need to set guardrails, ensure transparency, and create mechanisms for redress, because trust isn't optional, it's essential. AI should really serve people before profit. It should protect nature, not just model it. It should be a tool for justice, not a trigger for exclusion. We need to build AI that is not only smart, but fair, inclusive, and transformative. Thanks, Jen. So now I'll pass back to you.
Thank you so much, Jason. So I'll just open up to participants. Maybe we could have 2 questions, burning questions that you would like to ask Jason based on the presentation he just made. Are there any questions?
In the absence of any questions today, I think also what I can do is just speak to some of the ways that we're applying technology. It might be useful as a practical example. Within the evaluation space, we're seeing the emergence of agentic AIs as an incredibly useful capability. So currently we're building impact agents that allow organizations to curate their own knowledge bases and then apply the technology. So it means creating an AI agent which will allow you to have a conversation with your curated data, have a conversation with your database, and then still draw in third-party data to give you real-time insights, but with control on what sort of insights are being presented to you.
Okay. Thank you so much, Jason. I see there's a hand from Jean Providence. You can go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much for the presentation, Jason. Yeah, I'm very keen on what we can do in evaluation using AI. And I like the point you have raised about the potential bias. Is it the potential, actually the actual bias about cultural prejudices against some cultures, communities? Looking at it, as you said, AI is as effective as the language is used to train it. How can we have more of African languages captured under the AI infrastructure so that the reality of our people, of the communities are reflected whenever we are running anything using AI? Over. Thank you so much for a great, insightful presentation.
Thanks, John. So I think the best way to apply that, so the models are learning all the time. And as the data is constantly expanding, there's more and more African data available. And I think we need to make sure that those cultural knowledge sets are included. But what we can do now with the technology is we don't necessarily have to wait for these, the owners of the global models to do that. We can do that ourselves. So you can use the AI capability, but apply it into your own knowledge base and direct the agent to reflect on your own knowledge base ahead of its own. And I think that's really the significant evolution is seeing the large language models and the AI capability as really a starting point and applying that within our own context. So curating a knowledge base, applying the agent to then interrogate your own knowledge base ahead of its historical knowledge base, and equally to interrogate your own data sets. So the technology is very much a tool, and it's about how we apply those tools. The AI agents are increasingly able to synchronize across multiple data sets, but also start to bring together, as I was saying, different kinds of technologies. The Internet of Things, blockchain, drones, and a range of other emerging technologies are increasingly being coordinated and orchestrated through the AI agent capabilities. So as it's starting to use and integrate different technologies, equally we can use it to access and manage our own data sets without having to be dependent on what the large language models are being trained on. So we can update the training on an ongoing basis and set things like guardrails and moderation to ensure that the agent is kept in line, shall we say.
Okay, thank you so much, Jason. I think we can move on to the next presentation, and it'll be done by Rebecca. Rebecca, over to you.
Thank you so much, Sine. Thank you, Jason, for this presentation, and good afternoon, colleagues. And I'm very happy that we can have this discussion today. And I'm gonna build on Jason's presentation. So I would like to invite us to zoom out, to invite you to zoom out with me and look upstream, because while we are here discussing AI's contributions and contradictions in climate evaluation, which is the downstream part of the conversation, the upstream part is being shaped in some corners of the world by communities often underrepresented in these discussions. They are mining the minerals that go into the batteries that power the data centers that hold the cloud, where these climate predictive models actually run. So these communities pay the production cost of AI long before we even write our first line of code. These are the costs I would like us to explore in this part of the presentation. We can move on to the next slide. The first thing I think we need to establish is, we can move on to the next slide, Sive.
It's showing on my end. Not
All
quite
right.
sure if it's visible on your end. There we go.
Okay, I can see it now. Thank you. So I think the first thing that we need to establish is the fact that AI is not weightless. We get so focused on the intangible part, the data, the algorithms, the models, that we tend to ignore the massive physical infrastructure making it all possible. We can all agree that AI is anything but weightless. Its hardware relies heavily on critical minerals that tie us directly to some of the world's most problematic extraction sites. Some of these minerals include cobalt. The DRC supplies 76% of global cobalt production. That is 244,000 tons in 2024 alone. And this cobalt goes straight into the lithium-ion batteries powering every data center running AI models. And then we have coltan, which is another critical mineral for AI hardware. And the DRC holds 60% of its global reserves, primarily in the conflict-prone Kivu region in the eastern part of the DRC. And without coltan, we don't have capacitors that stabilize voltage in AI chips and enable high-speed computation in our GPUs and TPUs. And then we have lithium, which is geographically dispersed, but it is concentrated in Australia, Chile, and China. Moving on to the next slide. So when we try and trace cobalt and coltan back to their source, what we uncover is that there are a lot of hidden costs. And one of them is the combination of resource wars, community displacement, and environmental destruction. We have tech and AI companies creating massive demand for these minerals. This demand drives conflicts over mining territories, and we have armed groups who end up controlling these places, these regions, and the communities in these regions are often caught in conflict and are forced into mining activities. The impact of these mining activities on the environment is devastating, where artisanal mining emits high levels of CO2, causing severe soil erosions and water contamination. These regions and these activities are often powered by diesel generators, causing more pollution. And then the soil degradation destroys agricultural land. In Kivu, deforestation for coltan has reduced biodiversity by 40% since 2010. And within the same environmental layer, there's the issue of AI hardware returning back home. Although this is more of the downstream part of the conversation, it still deserves attention because in countries like Kenya, you have a huge e-waste problem, and it is the fastest growing waste stream, with an estimated 51,300 tons generated annually. So does the evaluation community play an active role in this reality? I think I will leave this open to the audience to respond, but I would like to submit to your consideration that we seem to be in a blind spot where we continue to measure the climate intervention outcomes, but not the environmental impacts of the tools that we use to evaluate these outcomes. Moving on to the next slide. As we are tracing back these minerals, what we discover is another cost, the human costs, which for me really paints a the whole picture even darker, because what we have is that as we speak right now, chances are really high that there is a child in the DRC who's mining the cobalt that will power the AI model predicting tomorrow's droughts in Kenya. That same cobalt will power the climate intervention developed based on those predictions. It will power the AI tools that evaluators will use to assess this intervention. And then we are going to celebrate climate progress in the next Global AI Summit on Africa. And if we pause right here and think about this, what we realize is that the child has powered the prediction, the intervention, the evaluation, and the celebration. But none of this conversation will mention the fact that this childhood was stolen, and that is the basis on which everything that is celebrated was made possible. The recorded numbers show 40,000 child minors nationwide in the DRC. Some are as young as 6 years old. The International Labour Organization has identified over 6,200 children in Haut-Katanga and Lualaba provinces only, and these children work up to 12 hours a day for less than $2. Moving on to the next slide. So trying to make sense of all of this lands us in a 4-stage cycle where each stage feeds the next, and child exploitation gets institutionalized with every single round that happens. In stage 1, we have primary exploitation, where the development of these AI prediction models sponsors the extraction of minerals that build the hardware that runs the climate models. And this extraction is done by child labor. And then in stage 2, we have systemic exploitation, where AI enables climate interventions. So the models developed in stage 1 inform climate interventions, and the exploitation becomes embedded in the foundation of climate response system. In stage 3, we have exploitation that is validated by the use of AI tools in our evaluations. And this gives scientific credibility to the exploitative system. By using these tools, we validate the system through our participation, and we reinforce the same exploitative supply chain. In stage 4, we have institutionalized erasure. We celebrate AI for climate progress, while the human cost that made it possible is completely erased. And we just have exploitation that is institutionalized. So the hard pill to swallow for us as evaluators is that we are part of the cycle. We are right there at stage 3, and we are using these models to measure climate progress while validating the very exploitation that powers our work. Moving on to the next slide. So this cycle doesn't just harm the communities where extraction happens, it creates profound implication for low resource settings. I think that's something that Jason also mentioned in his presentation. So we have these new dependencies that are being created. So should we be concerned about digital tech demand, resource demand? Yes, we should, because of these new dependencies that are being created. Firstly, there is computing infrastructure. These AI systems require massive energy investment that low resource settings simply can't sustain independently. Secondly, we are seeing technical expertise brain drain. So the skilled professionals needed to implement and maintain these AI solutions get pulled toward wealthy nations that can afford to pay them. In the third place, we have data sovereignty. Communities lose control over their own local climate data as it gets processed through systems they don't own or control. And then lastly, we have economic dependency, where we end up paying for tools that were literally built with our own resources or resources extracted from neighboring regions. So the exploitation system is not just being perpetuated, it's just recreating itself into new forms and creating new form of dependency downstream in the very communities we claim to be helping. Moving on to the next slide. So you might be thinking, but technology has always had problems like bad supply chains or unfair labor. So what is making AI different? And that is a fair question. And yes, efforts have been made and they are still happening currently. Some tools are using blockchain to trace where minerals like cobalt or coltan come from. There are legal cases pushing tech companies to clean up their supply chains, and there are new laws that are being passed to increase transparency. But even with all that, most evaluations still ignore how these AI tools are made. So yes, AI isn't just helping us analyze impacts, it's making visible everything we've historically overlooked. It is revealing patterns we didn't see before. It is shining the light on the inequalities and blind spots in our systems. But more than that, it's also turning the mirror on us as evaluators, our tools, our methods, and our assumptions. For the first time, we're working with a technology that magnifies the entire process, not just the outcomes of a program, but the costs of measuring those outcomes in the first place. And our traditional frameworks have, for a long time, focused on results. Did the program work? What changed? What can be improved? But right now, with the advent of AI, it is pushing us to ask deeper questions, harder questions. How were those results measured? What power did the tool that measured them? Who paid a price, seen or unseen, for the insight that we're using? So we can't really afford to assume that our technology is neutral just because we see ourselves as neutral evaluators. Our assumed neutrality doesn't change the fact that many of the tools we now use carry hidden costs, often paid by people in communities far removed from our reports and recommendation. So with the presence of AI in evaluation, we as evaluator we are at a crossroads where we have a choice. We can keep measuring outcomes while ignoring how our measurement tools are made, or we can expand our frameworks to reflect the full costs of the insight we produce and take responsibility for how we generate knowledge in the age of AI, which leads me to the last slide. So then what do we do with all this knowledge? And how do we move forward as evaluators who I believe are now able to see the full picture? Because we can see the full picture right now, I'm sure we're also realizing that we are not powerless in the situation, and we actually have a very unique position and we have a lot of value to bring. But that it will require us to move from complicity to consciousness. And this is a very different discussion, and it's a very different conversation from reducing our AI usage or finding more energy efficient algorithms. Those are operational improvements. This conversation is more about methodological innovation for our field, accounting for the true cost of evaluation itself by making visible the costs that have been systematically hidden from our frameworks. So I think this process will take 3 steps. The first one being for us to acknowledge our complicity. Our evaluation tools are embedded in extractive systems. We benefit from infrastructure built on exploitation, and our silence legitimizes this system. The second step will be to choose conscious participation, for us to center affected communities in our methodologies and question the power structure in our evaluation frameworks. And then the last step would be for us to evaluate responsibly. This might include drafting personal AI policy, creating tools that measure our evaluation tool impact, disclosing AI use transparently in our reports, and mentoring other evaluators on conscious AI use. And I believe that this will be our unique value as evaluators. Since we cannot step outside the extractive systems, we can still choose how we participate in it. And our choice and our consciousness is what's going to make the difference. And that's what's going to transform our complicity into accountability. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much, Rebecca. That was quite insightful. And I think, it feeds in perfectly to the next presentation, which looks at some Made in Africa guidelines that have been developed to contribute to some of the issues that you've raised. But before we go to the next presentation, I just want to check if there are any burning questions from the participants. So I'll just take maybe one or two questions. And please feel free to also put questions on the chat box. We will have a Q&A session at the end of all presentations. So we'll get to those. But are there any burning questions at the moment? Okay, so I think in the absence of those questions, we can go on to your presentation, Jen. Over to you.
Okay, thanks. First off, I just want to thank Jason and Rebecca for your both of those presentations are just really so enlightening and provocative. Rebecca's particularly is just very provocative, really leaves a lot to really think about. And I feel like this presentation on these two evaluation criteria almost takes us back a little bit because it doesn't talk about AI. But anyways, so I'm going to briefly introduce participants to two evaluation criteria that, as Sneh said in the beginning, were developed in collaboration between SAMEA, DPME, and other partners. So you can move on to the next slide. And these were developed in 2021 into 2022 starting out in 2021 during an evaluation hackathon. And so in the conversation today, we've heard about needing to bring kind of AI, bring a human-centered approach into AI. Rebecca's also really talked about kind of the human cost, the human elements, but also recognizing the implications of AI on our climate, on our ecosystems. And so the two evaluation criteria that I am introducing us to also are really trying to look at this nexus between us humans as well as the environment or as the planet and nature broadly. That, typically we often think of ourselves as humans here at the top and it being more of a kind of a triangle, and somehow we are seeing ourselves as kind of above all other aspects of nature. But really, we are part of more of an ecosystem and are all interdependent. And so these two criteria are really urging that we need to move away from this idea that nature is something to be exploited and that it is, and understand that we need a healthy ecosystem in order for us to survive and thrive. And we also recognize that, particularly in South Africa, there is just such enormous amounts of inequity, and that we need to fix these structural problems, these structural issues within the country, both within South Africa, but also globally, to really address these issues of inequity. And we heard also earlier about even inequity in terms of the digital space. So how can M&E contribute? So the hypothesis of these two criteria is that we feel that by mainstreaming climate and ecosystems health and equity lenses or focuses on into all evaluations, that by doing this we'll eventually start to change the recommendations for new programming that will then lead to more regenerative and equitable society. So the first criterion is the transformative equity criterion. You can move to the next slide. So the transformative equity criterion looks at the extent to which an intervention's objectives, design, implementation, and impact contribute to or do not contribute to addressing systemic inequities and promoting a more inclusive society. And within this criterion, we have 5 different dimensions that are looking at issues of kind of the population, of like who benefits, who loses, who is included, who is excluded. And so already we've heard, about kind of the historically marginalized, those that are most vulnerable, but it's really ensuring that in our evaluation, both in the questions and who we're asking, but also in the process of the evaluation, that it is really inclusive. The second dimension looks at issues of cause and effect. So looking at kind of the structural factors that kind of perpetuate issues of inequity and how inequity is playing out in the deep systems and how those need to be changed. So issues of ownership, for instance. Then the third is space, sort of a geographical component. And we know that in South Africa, especially, but in other countries as well, issues of geography and the spatial factors is really, really just so critical to understanding issues of inequity. The fourth dimension is content and intention, and is really looking at the extent to which an intervention has a transformative change potential and whether interventions are really designed to try to promote such change. And then the fifth dimension is looking at time with 2 different components. So, but one view of it is looking at trying to understand the time frame within which the intervention and the evaluation itself is taking place. What is the political discourse? How is that going to affect the way people interact and participate in the evaluation? What was the motive driving an intervention? And then also looking at the durability of equity results. And within the evaluation criterion, so that we have these 2 criteria, and they're both part of a larger set of guidelines. And so on the next slide, we have a list of principles that are in the guidelines to guide evaluators, but also evaluation commissioners and program managers in terms of how to bring equity into evaluations. So this includes issues of recognizing equality, justice, and respect for human dignity, having an awareness of power and voice, particularly about how power manifests, so being aware of one's own position of power and how people might perceive us and how that will influence the evaluation process, but also to be very conscious about giving voice to those who traditionally do not have voice. We brought in the concept of Ubuntu and trying to really embed that idea that there are multiple ways of knowing and recognizing that it is not just in the physical present here and now, but that we have that there's the relationality with different not time zones, but with the past, with the present, with the physical and the non-physical. And then the principle of inclusivity, so the intentional inclusion of different identities and geographies, and then having systems thinking. So that is the transformative equity criterion and guidelines. And then we can move to the climate and ecosystems health criterion. So the climate and ecosystems health criterion is looking at whether an intervention degrades or regenerates climate and ecosystems health, but also looking at how an intervention might be affected by changes in the environment, changes in our climate. And a lot of what Rebecca was showing was really showing this quite nicely, using AI as a kind of a case to be examining these issues. So it looks at the impacts of the intervention on the climate and ecosystems health, looking at what resources are consumed, what waste is produced or pollution produced. So what is it, how does an intervention affect the area in which it is taking place? And while Rebecca was talking about it, like often in evaluations, we're looking kind of just at the specific here and now. And she's also encouraging that we look further or downstream, and really be considering all of the other ways that we are consuming without necessarily thinking about it. Then the second is the impacts of climate change and degradation, ecosystem degradation on the intervention. So if there were floods or wildfires or drought, how is that affecting, for instance, an intervention that might be about a community garden system to ensure and improve food security. And then a third dimension also is looking at kind of the adaptive capacity of the intervention. So what is the extent to which the intervention is building into the intervention, into the people that are part of it, this ability to be adaptive and minimizing the effects of climate change and degradation. You can move to the next slide. The next slide is really just showing this again in somewhat of a simpler way. But I wanted to use this page to just also say that in the past year, we've had some young and emerging evaluators who've been working with us at SAMEA on trying to identify a range of indicators and resources and like toolkits that can be used by evaluators to help us to think through really how to apply these criteria to our evaluations. Because if, you know, as I said in the beginning of my session, my presentation, we're hoping that all evaluations would be using these two criteria. And not everybody is an expert in issues of climate and ecosystems health. And not everybody is an expert on issues of equity. And so how would what are some guidances, deeper, useful tools that can help us as we're really looking at these two issues as we go into our evaluations. So that is the two criteria, but I think, and so I suppose what I would like to say is it really does, the presentations by Jason and Rebecca, you know, it gives us so much that we can kind of take further with these two criteria, and how we at SAMEA, as we're trying to work through these, like need to think perhaps about how to expand on them a little bit more. And I do really appreciate, Rebecca, your kind of using the case that you gave us with AI as a way of unpacking these issues of resource use, exploitation, justice, injustice, and so on. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much, Jen. Are there any burning questions in relation to Jen's presentation from the floor? Okay. I think there was a question in the chat box. The question is, how do we engage with AI as M&E practitioners to create inclusivity and equity through our work? So I think we can just answer that question first. Maybe I'll start with you, Jason. You have an answer.
Thanks, Sine. Yeah, I think the best way for us to effectively harness the AI while considering those issues of bias and also driving inclusion is, as we'd said before, is to use the tools, but to curate the base of knowledge that it's using to respond from. So that also gives us a level of control outside of the natural language training, where we can ensure that there is a consideration of that potential bias and also those local knowledge sets that have not been included. So it allows us to augment the existing knowledge base on the large language models and then apply the tools in the way that we see fit.
Okay, thank you so much, Jason. Not sure if Rebecca and Jen want to also add something, no? Okay,
No, I
so,
think Rebecca, do you want
Yes,
to?
I just
Yeah.
wanted to add on what Jason said right now, and I think it takes a lot of intentionality to keep ourselves aware of what needs to go into the work, right? And there is a level of accountability that we have, and we need to be aware of how we position ourselves. And I've always said this to other colleagues around me. It doesn't take too much to just try and research a bit more on how I personally, as an evaluator, play a role in this instead of always looking at the collective. How would the change come from me as a person, as an evaluator? So I think that can also be one of the ways to engage with AI in an inclusive and equitable way.
Thank you, Rebecca. Jen?
So I mean, I don't have an answer specifically. I'm definitely not one to know much about AI. So I just to say that the evaluation, the equity guidelines does talk quite a bit about how to be very intentional about bringing in marginalized people onto steering committees and the need of ensuring that there is feedback and meaningful feedback of the data. And I would imagine that that would be true. That also, like as we engage with the communities that are participating in the evaluation, that it's always shared back. Whether it's so, I'm not sure how the AI part would come into that. I wonder though, maybe Jason or Rebecca, if there are specific tools that you are familiar with that are really trying to do this. Like there's this Qualia, I think I shared it with Jason, this Qualia AI-led interviewing tool. And so you can it will set up questions, and it will ask it either audibly or typing it. It will ask a set of questions, and you can start responding, and it will change languages if it starts hearing, even in Swahili or other languages. It starts changing the language in which it's conducting the interview. But that's just a very minor example.
Thanks, Jen. I mean, I think from our side, in terms of the range of tools that are available, they're literally growing on a daily basis. So I think the best approach to take is to kind of that lifelong learning has never been more relevant. And I think it is about staying aware and staying engaged with that evolving landscape, but also to consider the role of the tool and how it's applied rather than which specific tool is available off the shelf, because there are a lot of service offerings that allow you to simply subscribe and apply the tool. But often we don't know what's under the hood and what's happening to the data that the system is using. So I think regardless of the tools that you're applying, it's important to interrogate those conditions of use. Increasingly, data is a commodity, and a commodity that's increasingly commercialized. So we need to consider what data is being used by the agents or the tools that we're applying, and how much control do we have on that. But also then to look at generic tools that can be used within a local context. And often what we're using AI for is to help us with things like analysis, with data synthesis, with trends, with visualizations, and even things like translation. And a lot of those capabilities are going to become increasingly generically available. And what we need to be doing is to drive that agenda of localization and also contextualization. So we're incorporating our own knowledge sets into the function of the AI, rather than handing over responsibility into a service provider where we don't necessarily know what the data is going to be used for.
Okay, thank you so much, Jason. I'm just going to check again if we have any questions from the participants. You can just raise your hand if you have any question.
I think Rebecca was going to ask questions to the audience.
Okay, you can go ahead, Rebecca.
Thank you, Jane. I think we have covered quite a lot of the issues that needs to be addressed in terms of using AI for evaluation, for climate, but also other evaluations in general. And I think for the audience, what we would like to understand is how have you been able to identify the pros and cons of AI in your daily work? How has that experience been so far with the use of AI? What are some of the things that you've noticed would improve the field or would make things worse for us? And then I think that can be the very beginning, the very starting point of drafting those AI policies. For some of us who don't have it yet, it doesn't have to start as a huge process. It's really just asking ourselves the right questions. Okay, I've been using ChatGPT to analyze some of this data, but this is what I've noticed about this, and this is why I'm thinking maybe I shouldn't use ChatGPT for this specific task. Maybe I should use another tool. What other tool is out there that is built on equity and inclusivity that I can use? And this is joining to what Jason was saying before. There are so many tools out there that are developed each and every single day, and that can give us that space where we can apply ourselves as evaluators, but using AI tools that do not perpetuate the extractive systems and the exploitative systems. So then my question is, what are some of the things and very, very simple element that you've noticed in your use of AI for evaluation that you believe could improve the field or is going to perpetuate more exploitative systems? And I'm sure there won't be any answers at the moment, but that's, if you do find an answer to that, maybe use that already to start drafting your policy. I will use AI for this, and I will not use AI for that. And I think it's a good start already. I'm not sure. I'm seeing some messages in the chat, Sneh.
Jason just had to catch his flight, so he had to depart early.
All right. So I think that's my question to the audience, and hopefully it triggers something after the session.
Okay. I think in the absence of questions, we can go on to wrapping up the session. And I think, firstly, I want to thank all the panelists for such insightful presentations. And my key takeaways from the presentations that have been made is that, firstly, AI is a powerful tool for climate action, but it does come with risks, and that we as evaluators or M&E professionals, we should be considerate of that in us doing our evaluations or conducting our evaluations. Thank you to Rebecca for outlining some of the hidden costs of AI matter, which we do need to consider as well. Lastly, that equity and sustainability must be at the center of the work that we do. So thank you so much for availing yourselves for this panel today. And thank you so much to the participants for joining in and listening in. And we hope that some of the information that has been shared today, that you will then use within your respective workplaces. Thank you so much. I think we can now close the session.
Yeah, thanks, Sine. And yes, please do get in touch. SAMEA has some other sessions happening this week and a lot happening this coming year on our 20th anniversary. So we look forward to being in contact.